In the worst drought in 35 years, the oldest female in the herd, the one too old to breed, the one a spreadsheet would have retired, is the only reason any of the young survive. She is not leading them to food she can smell. She is leading them to water she last saw as a calf 40 years ago. This is Tarangire in Tanzania in 1993. The rains fail completely. Researchers are tracking elephant families through it, and at the end, they count the calves. Of 81, 16 are dead. But the deaths are not spread evenly. The family whose matriarch is around 33, too young to remember the last great drought of the late 1950s, stays where it is and loses most of its young. The two families led by matriarchs in their late 30s and 40s, old enough to have lived through that earlier drought as children, walk out of the park toward water they learned about decades before and keep their calves alive. A biologist named Karen McComb, working with Cynthia Moss at Amboseli, had already shown why. In 2001, in the journal Science, she demonstrated that families with older matriarchs were simply better at telling a real threat from a false one, better at reading which calls meant danger. A later study showed the same for predators. The oldest female is not a passenger. She is the family's memory, its map, and its early warning system, all in one body that has stopped reproducing and is, by every shallow measure, expendable. So here is the question that should follow you out of this. What happens to a group when it decides that its oldest, most experienced members are a cost to be cut? You already know the feeling. You have watched an organization push out the people who remembered why things were done a certain way, and then watched it walk straight into the exact wall they would have seen coming. In 213 before the Common Era, the first emperor of China decided that memory itself was a threat to him. His name was Qin Shi Huang, and on the advice of his chancellor Li Si, he ordered the burning of nearly every book in the empire. Histories, philosophy, the records of every kingdom that came before him, all of it to the fire, sparing only manuals on farming, medicine, and divination. The reasoning was precise, not mad. As long as scholars could read about the past, they could compare him to it and find him wanting. Erase the record, and there is nothing left to measure him against. The historian Sima Qian, writing a century later, records that the following year the emperor went further and had 460 scholars buried alive. We should be honest that this second event rests on a single later source, but the burning is well attested, and the logic is the thing to hold on to. He was not destroying paper. He was destroying the only people who could remember how things had been done before him and whether they had been done better. The dynasty he built to last 10,000 years did not outlive his own son. 18 centuries later, in a different empire, the same instinct cost a kingdom its harvest. In 1609, King Philip III of Spain, pushed by his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, signed an order expelling roughly 300,000 Moriscos, the descendants of Spain's Muslim population. It was framed as a matter of loyalty and faith. But in the kingdoms of Valencia and Aragon, the Moriscos were something specific and irreplaceable. They were the men who knew the water. For centuries they had maintained the canals, the terraces, the intricate systems of irrigation that turned dry land into farmland. The knowledge was not written down. It lived in them. When they were marched to the coast and shipped out, the water still came down from the mountains. But the people who knew how to move it across the fields were gone. About a third of Valencia's population vanished in a stroke. Fields went fallow. Whole districts collapsed and did not recover for generations. The kingdom kept the land and expelled the knowledge of how to use it, and then could not understand why the land stopped giving. Now come inside living memory, to the clearest version of all. In 1937, Joseph Stalin turned his terror on the one institution a country cannot improvise in a crisis: its army. On the 11th of June, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the most brilliant military mind the Soviet Union had, was convicted in a closed trial on confessions beaten out of him, and shot the next day along with 7 of his senior commanders. It did not stop there. Roughly 2/3 of the Red Army's generals were arrested, about half of them executed. And the pattern inside the purge is the part that should chill you. The more capable an officer was, the more likely he was to be killed, because competence near a frightened ruler reads as a threat. 4 years later, the bill came due. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army that met it had been gutted of the men who knew how to fight. The early months were a catastrophe measured in millions. Stalin had not lost a battle. He had, years earlier, shot the people who knew how to win one, and then was surprised to find no one left who did. Now go back to the matriarch on the cracked earth of Tarangire, walking toward water no one else can remember. We like to imagine that knowledge lives in institutions, in archives, in the average. It does not. It lives in specific, aging individuals, and when they go, it goes with them, even when the paperwork stays behind. The elephant did not invent this problem, and neither did we. We inherited the same brutal arithmetic, that a group is only ever as deep as the memory of its oldest member, and the same fatal temptation to treat that member as overhead. And it is happening right now, in the most advanced institutions we have. NASA still has the blueprints for the Saturn V, the rocket that took human beings to the moon. What it lost was the engineers. The 1,000 small things they knew that never made it onto a drawing. How the real machine differed from the plan, retired with them. In 2015, when a team troubleshooting a new capsule went looking for the old lessons, they could not find them in any system. They spent months tracking down retired engineers and the agency's own historian. A researcher named Janet Vartisi calls it Tacit Uninvention, a technology you can no longer build, not because the plans are gone, but because the people who held the group's memory are. We did not lose the moon rocket. We let the people who remembered how to build it walk out the door. So here is the verdict, with no hedging. Knowledge does not live where you store it. It lives in the oldest, most experienced people in the room. And every group that treats them as a cost rather than a vault is borrowing against a debt that comes due at the worst possible moment. In the drought, in the war, in the crisis it could have survived. The matriarch is never the most expensive member of the herd. She is the cheapest insurance it will ever buy, and the last thing it should ever cut. Which leaves you with one question, and it is about your own life, not Rome or Tarangire. Think of the person near you who remembers how it was done before, the one easy to dismiss as slow or old or in the way. What does only that person know? And what happens to all of you on the day they are finally gone and the drought arrives, and there is no one left who has seen this before?